There's a hidden flaw in the way we think about ourselves. It's quiet, invisible, and yet it shapes everything we do, every word we speak, every relationship we cling to or destroy. Freud saw it more than a century ago, and while the world moved on, distracted by new theories and self-help slogans, the truth he uncovered still lingers beneath the surface, whispering through our mistakes and our desires. This flaw isn't a failure of intelligence or morality. It's something far deeper, buried within the architecture of our minds, a subtle distortion that began in childhood and has never stopped steering our lives. Before we dive into this shadow within, take a deep breath. This isn't just a story about psychology, it's a story about you. And maybe, by the time you reach the end, you'll start to see your own reflection in places you never thought to look. If you find yourself drawn to these reflections, I invite you gently to subscribe to this channel, not because you have to, but because somewhere inside you already feel there's more to uncover about who you are, and I want to walk that path with you. Freud once said that no one really wants to face their own unconscious. It's not because we lack courage, but because we've built entire lives around not doing so. The unconscious, in Freud's view, isn't just a dark basement full of forgotten memories. It's an active, living force that disguises itself as your thoughts, your humor, your fears, and your love. And inside that force, there's a contradiction, the flaw. We want to be loved, but we also fear being truly seen. We crave freedom, but we cling to the very patterns that imprison us. We say we want truth, but secretly, we prefer comfort. Freud believed that our minds are like icebergs. The visible part, the conscious, is small and fragile, while the massive foundation lies below, hidden. Most of us live only on the surface, navigating the visible world of our jobs, relationships, ambitions, and routines. Yet underneath, the unconscious keeps replaying the same emotional loops written long ago. A parent's absence, a rejection, a shame we couldn't name. These become the script we unknowingly follow. We think we're making choices, but in truth, we're often reenacting unresolved fragments of the past. And here is the flaw. We confuse understanding with healing. We believe that by knowing the reason for our pain, we'll be free of it. But Freud realized something far more unsettling. Knowledge doesn't dissolve the unconscious. It only makes us aware of its power. You can know exactly why you sabotage relationships, why you procrastinate, why you chase approval, and still repeat the same behaviors endlessly. That is the flaw, the gap between awareness and transformation, between thinking and truly feeling. Maybe you've noticed it in your own life. You promise yourself you'll stop falling for emotionally unavailable people. You understand that it stems from a childhood wound, maybe a distant parent or inconsistent love. Yet months later, you find yourself back in the same dynamic. You rationalize, you justify, you explain, and still you feel the same ache. Freud would say that your unconscious has not yet surrendered its investment in that pattern. The mind doesn't want to let go of pain. It wants to repeat it until it feels different. It's what he called the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to relive what hurt us, hoping to master it this time. But mastery never comes, only exhaustion. When Freud exposed this, people resisted fiercely. It's not pleasant to realize that we are less in control than we imagine. But this resistance itself, the denial, the rationalizing, the joking, is proof of the unconscious at work. It protects us from seeing too much too soon. And so we keep living, half asleep, half aware, proud of our insights, yet trapped in our emotions. Now I want to pause here and ask you something real. Have you ever caught yourself repeating the same emotional mistake, even after swearing you'd never do it again? The same argument, the same apology, the same feeling of emptiness afterward. If you have, you're not broken. You're human. And maybe you can share that moment below in the comments. Right, I've seen my unconscious patterns and I'm learning to face them. Copy and paste it if you want. Because sharing your truth, even in small ways, begins to weaken the silence that the unconscious depends on. Freud's flaw, or rather, the flaw he revealed, is not that we are flawed beings, but that we are built around what we can't admit. The unconscious is like a mirror that refuses to reflect directly. It speaks in symbols, in slips of the tongue, in dreams. You might think you've forgotten your past, but the body remembers. The tone you use, the partners you choose, the jobs you hate but can't leave, all of these are the unconscious in motion. It doesn't just store memories, it organizes our reality around them. Imagine a child who learns that love is unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, depending on the mood of a parent. That child grows up internalizing a lesson. Love equals uncertainty. As an adult, they may unconsciously seek relationships that recreate that same instability, not because they enjoy suffering, but because it feels familiar. Freud believed the psyche prefers familiar pain to unfamiliar peace. The unconscious doesn't aim for happiness, it aims for repetition, because repetition feels safe even when it hurts. This is why so many of us are drawn to the same kinds of partners, jobs, or conflicts again and again. The flaw isn't just that we repeat, it's that we think our repetition is choice. Freud called this transference, when we transfer old emotions from our past onto new people or situations. We see our parents in our lovers, our childhood struggles in our careers. And when things fall apart, we think we've failed, when in fact we've only reenacted an old scene. To see this clearly requires a kind of honesty that few of us are ready for. Because to admit that your present is built from your past means that your freedom might be smaller than you thought, but it also means something liberating. Once you become aware of the script, you can begin to rewrite it, not by force, not by intellect, but by feeling the truth that has been avoided. Freud's therapy wasn't about advice, it was about listening. Deep, patient listening, to words, to silences, to the slips that reveal what the conscious mind tries to hide. He often said, "Where the id was, there the ego shall be." In other words, where the unconscious once ruled, consciousness can one day arrive. But that arrival isn't a triumphant revelation. It's a slow, painful acknowledgement of everything we tried not to feel. You don't conquer the unconscious. You learn to coexist with it. Think of the last time you got angry over something small, a message left unread, a tone of voice, a forgotten promise. On the surface, it seems trivial, but beneath it, there might be a much older emotion. The child who felt invisible, the teenager who felt dismissed. The present becomes the stage where the past performs again. That is the flaw Freud uncovered. Our tendency to live in yesterday's play, thinking it's today's story. And yet, there's hope in this realization. Because once you start noticing the pattern, even faintly, something begins to shift. Awareness may not cure, but it opens a door. You start pausing before reacting. You feel the echo of an old wound before it speaks through you. You realize that your anger isn't about the message, it's about the memory. And that realization, gentle and unforced, begins the slow process of transformation. Freud's genius wasn't just in describing this flaw, it was in showing us that the flaw itself is what makes us human. The gap between knowing and feeling, between wanting and doing, is where all our stories unfold. If we were perfectly rational, life would be sterile. It's our contradictions that give us depth. Our flaws are not failures. They are the evidence that we are alive, that something inside us is still struggling toward meaning. But Freud also warned that most people will never truly face this, because to confront the unconscious is to question the self you think you are. The ego resists, invents narratives, blames others, explains, deflects. It says, "I'm fine," or "That's just how I am." It hides behind humor, control, or cynicism. Yet beneath all that noise lies the silent truth that we are still haunted by what we could not bear to feel. When Freud first introduced these ideas, he wasn't trying to humiliate humanity. He was trying to make sense of suffering. He noticed that people came to him not just with symptoms, hysteria, obsessions, phobias, but with stories that didn't add up logically. The mind, he realized, doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in wishes and fears. The flaw is not that we are irrational. It's that we pretend not to be. And if you look closely at your own life, you'll see how that flaw quietly guides you. The excuses you make for others, the dreams you abandon before they begin, the way you say, "I'm okay," when something inside is breaking. These are not random. They are the unconscious protecting its territory. Freud would say, your unconscious isn't your enemy. It's your oldest companion, the one who remembers everything you've tried to forget. When you start to realize that your unconscious remembers everything, even what your mind insists it has forgotten, you begin to see how nothing in your emotional life is random. Every sudden mood, every attraction, every fear that seems to come out of nowhere is the unconscious speaking in its own language. Freud often compared the unconscious to a foreign country within the self, familiar and strange at the same time. You live in it, yet you don't fully understand its customs. And sometimes when you dream, or when you say something you didn't mean to say, you catch a glimpse of that landscape. In dreams, Freud saw the royal road to the unconscious. But dreams are not simple messages. They are coded letters from the mind to itself. You dream of falling, of being chased, of losing your voice. You wake up shaken, but you tell yourself it's meaningless. Freud would have smiled at that denial. He believed that every dream is a disguised fulfillment of a wish, often one we don't dare to admit. You dream of being late, not because of the literal fear of lateness, but because deep inside you fear missing out on life or on someone who once mattered. You dream of flying because you crave freedom from a duty that feels suffocating. The dream doesn't tell you what you want in words. It lets you feel what you can't face when awake. This is the heart of the flaw, our constant attempt to live consciously when so much of who we are is unconscious. We strive to control, to plan, to rationalize, but the unconscious doesn't obey reason. It moves like water, finding cracks, seeping through emotions, reshaping everything silently. You may try to suppress a feeling, to move on, to start fresh, but repression doesn't erase, it stores. Every time you repress, the energy doesn't disappear. It hides and waits. It finds another way to express itself, through anxiety, fatigue, self-sabotage, or the body itself. The symptom becomes the story the conscious mind refuses to tell. Freud once treated a woman who couldn't walk, though no physical reason explained her paralysis. Through analysis, he discovered that her symptom was symbolic, an expression of guilt and anger she couldn't admit consciously. Her legs carried the emotional burden her mind refused to face. When she finally spoke the truth, when she allowed the repressed emotion to reach awareness, her paralysis disappeared. Freud called this the talking cure. But it wasn't the words that healed. It was the emotional honesty behind them. The flaw, therefore, isn't just ignorance of the unconscious. It's the fear of feeling what it contains. You've probably felt something similar in your own way. Maybe you've had a physical tension that no doctor could explain, a knot in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, an exhaustion that goes beyond the body. These are not always illnesses. Sometimes they are messages. Your body speaks when your voice cannot. And Freud would say, listen. Listen not as a scientist dissects a specimen, but as a friend comforts a wounded soul. The modern world has taught us to treat emotions like inconveniences, to move on, to stay positive. But repression disguised as optimism is still repression. Freud saw that the pursuit of happiness, when built on denial, only deepens our suffering. Because the unconscious doesn't disappear when ignored, it simply finds new disguises. A person who never allowed themselves to cry might become excessively controlling, obsessed with order, as a way to manage the chaos they fear within. Another might become overly giving, unable to say no, because they once learned that love must be earned through sacrifice. Each of these is a defense, a mask worn to protect the fragile truth underneath. If you could see your defenses clearly, not as flaws, but as survival tools, you might begin to understand yourself with compassion. Freud never wanted people to feel ashamed of their neuroses. He believed that our symptoms are the poems of the soul, imperfect, cryptic, but sincere. They are the evidence of our struggle to reconcile desire and reality. And within that struggle, we find our humanity. The flaw he exposed wasn't meant to condemn us, it was meant to awaken us, to make us see that beneath our masks, there's a child still longing for love, still afraid of rejection, still replaying old scenes hoping for a different ending. This longing is universal. Every human being, no matter how rational, carries the trace of that inner child, the one who once needed comfort and didn't get it, who once felt small and learned to compensate by being strong, successful, or detached. But beneath those compensations, the need remains, pulsing quietly through everything we do. Think of the way you react when someone doesn't text you back, or when your work is unacknowledged. The intensity of your feeling often has little to do with the present event. It's the echo of something older, deeper, the ancient need for validation that was once unmet. Freud believed that if we could follow these emotional threads back far enough, we'd always find the same root, the child's early relationship with love, loss, and desire. That's why he said, "The child is father of the man." Our adult lives are built upon the emotional architecture of our childhood, and yet this insight alone doesn't free us. Knowing that your current pain mirrors an old one doesn't dissolve it. That's the flaw, the tragic gap between knowing and feeling. Healing, Freud understood, happens only when you allow yourself to feel the repressed emotion fully, to relive it safely, and to see it with compassion rather than judgment. It's not an intellectual process, it's an emotional surrender. At this point in your life, you might be wondering, how do you do that? How do you face something that has been hidden for decades? Freud would say, start by observing your resistances. Notice the moments when you feel bored, defensive, or dismissive during an emotional conversation. Those are not random. They are the unconscious guarding its secrets. Each resistance hides something precious, a truth you once needed to avoid in order to survive. But you're not that vulnerable child anymore. You can look now, gently, without fear. And this is where the real transformation begins. Not through control, but through curiosity. The unconscious doesn't yield to force. It responds to attention. The more you listen to your emotions without judgment, the more the repressed begins to soften. You might cry unexpectedly. You might dream vividly. You might feel an old grief returning. That's not regression, that's release. The unconscious is finally speaking, and you're finally ready to hear. Freud's work often sounded pessimistic to his critics. They said he reduced everything to sex, to childhood, to suffering. But beneath the surface of his theories, there was a quiet compassion. He knew that human beings are not evil, they are conflicted. We love and hate the same people. We desire what hurts us. We reject what could heal us. And this, he believed, is not failure. It is the nature of being human. To be whole, we must stop pretending to be pure. When you stop fighting your contradictions, something extraordinary happens. You begin to live with authenticity. You stop trying to appear healed, and you start allowing yourself to be real. You realize that the parts of you you've tried to hide, the anger, the jealousy, the insecurity, are not enemies. They are messages. They are the parts that still long for understanding. And when you stop judging them, you create space for self-compassion. That, Freud would say, is the beginning of true integration. He once described the goal of psychoanalysis as turning hysterical misery into common unhappiness. At first, that sounds bleak, but what he meant was simple. When we accept the imperfection of life, we stop demanding that it heal our childhood wounds. We learn to suffer consciously, to love imperfectly, to live honestly. That's maturity, not the absence of pain, but the courage to face it without illusion. And maybe, in your own quiet moments, you've already felt glimpses of this. When you stop chasing closure from someone who will never give it, when you forgive yourself for staying too long, when you finally say, "I don't need to understand everything to move on," that's not giving up. That's growth. Freud's legacy is not a manual for happiness, but a mirror for truth. And truth, though painful, always brings freedom. You see, the flaw Freud exposed wasn't a defect to be fixed. It was a doorway into the inner world where all our contradictions live. Once you step through it, you start to see others differently too. You realize that everyone is acting from their own unconscious wounds, that cruelty often hides fear, that arrogance masks shame, that silence conceals longing. You become less judgmental, not because you excuse behavior, but because you understand its origins. And in that understanding, empathy begins. You see that every person you meet is wrestling with the same invisible flaw, the tension between their conscious life and their unconscious truth. And suddenly, instead of resentment, you feel compassion because you recognize yourself in them. Once you begin to see others through this Freudian lens, the world softens. You start to realize that most conflicts are not truly about what they appear to be. The argument about money, the fight about a text message, the distance between two friends, beneath each of these there is something ancient playing out, a buried emotion asking to be seen. Freud would say that society itself is built upon this same flaw, the repression of instinct. Civilization, he argued, requires us to restrain our desires, to repress aggression and lust, to exchange freedom for safety. That's the price we pay to live together. But repression has a cost. What we repress collectively doesn't vanish. It simmers beneath the surface, erupting in wars, prejudice, and hatred. The unconscious is not only individual, it's cultural. And when you look at our world today, the anxiety, the addiction to distraction, the endless search for validation, you can see the same flaw magnified. We've built technologies that promise connection, but deepen our loneliness. We've created cultures obsessed with image, control, and productivity, while silently starving for meaning. Freud might say that we've turned repression into a lifestyle. We curate our identities online, polish our smiles, and hide our fears behind irony or humor. But the unconscious doesn't care about your profile picture. It knows the truth. It knows what you long for, what you avoid, what you can't forgive. That's why, despite all our progress, the human heart feels the same as it did a century ago. We still dream the same dreams. We still repeat the same patterns, because the unconscious hasn't evolved with our technology. It still speaks the language of childhood, of love and loss, of fear and longing, and until we learn to listen, it will keep finding ways to remind us. Sometimes through heartbreak, sometimes through illness, sometimes through the quiet emptiness that follows every achievement. There's a moment that comes in every honest confrontation with the self, the moment you realize that no one else can save you from your unconscious. Not your partner, not your therapist, not your success. They can guide, mirror, or accompany you, but the journey inward is yours alone. Freud called it working through, the slow, patient process of facing, understanding, and integrating what was once repressed. It's not dramatic. It happens in small moments, when you stop running from discomfort, when you sit with a painful memory and simply breathe, when you forgive someone not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. And as you do this, something changes. The unconscious doesn't vanish, but it becomes less of a tyrant. The same triggers still appear, but they lose their power. The ghosts of the past still whisper, but they no longer control your choices. You begin to live with awareness, not perfect awareness, but enough to choose differently. Freud never promised happiness. He promised freedom, the freedom to live consciously, even amid imperfection. Think about the relationships that have shaped you most, the ones that broke you open, the ones that made you feel alive, the ones that left scars. Each of them, in some way, was your unconscious trying to teach you about yourself. That person you couldn't let go of, despite the pain. They reflected your earliest unmet need. That friend you always felt you had to impress. They mirrored your longing to be seen. The betrayal that shattered you, it brought to the surface the old fear of abandonment that you had buried. Freud's insight was that love is never just love. It's also repetition. We fall for people who allow us to re-experience the wounds we need to heal, and we stay until we've learned what we came to learn, or until we finally choose differently. When you understand this, forgiveness becomes less of a moral act and more of a psychological one. You forgive not to absolve the other, but to stop the cycle within yourself. You realize that every disappointment was your unconscious trying to finish an unfinished story. And once you see that, you can begin to write a new one. If you're watching this and something inside you is stirring, a memory, a sadness, maybe a quiet recognition, let that feeling stay. Don't rush to interpret it. The unconscious doesn't need to be solved, it needs to be felt. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's love, maybe it's both. Allow it to exist. That's what Freud meant when he spoke of bringing the unconscious into consciousness. Not through analysis alone, but through presence. I want to pause here just for a moment and speak directly to you. If you've ever felt trapped in a cycle you don't understand, if you've ever said to yourself, "Why do I keep doing this? Why can't I change?" Please know you are not weak. You are human. The unconscious is not a flaw to fix. It's the ocean beneath the surface of your life, and learning to swim in it, to face its waves, its darkness, its beauty, is the work of a lifetime. You are already doing it, just by watching, just by listening, just by wondering. And if this reflection resonates with you, if it touches something you've long kept silent, I invite you, with warmth, not pressure, to subscribe. Because what we explore here isn't just theory, it's the shared human experience of feeling, healing, and remembering who we are beneath the masks. You don't have to do it alone. We walk this path together. Freud's flaw, as many later called it, was his refusal to idealize human nature. He saw too clearly that beneath every virtue lies a shadow, and beneath every shadow a longing for light. He believed that the same instincts that cause our suffering, desire, aggression, dependency, are also the roots of our creativity, our art, our love. The unconscious is not evil, it's raw energy. When we repress it, it becomes symptom. When we accept it, it becomes life force. This is perhaps the most beautiful paradox Freud left us with. What we fear most within ourselves often holds the key to our vitality. The anger you repress could become courage. The longing you deny could become intimacy. The pain you hide could become wisdom. But only if you stop pretending it isn't there. And so, maybe the real flaw isn't psychological at all. Maybe it's spiritual, our refusal to accept our own depth. We live on the surface, worshipping clarity, afraid of mystery. But life, as Freud knew, is not meant to be fully understood. It's meant to be experienced, to be felt, to be lived with awareness. The unconscious will always remain partly hidden, and that's not failure. It's the condition of being alive. When Freud died, he reportedly said, "The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing." That soft voice, the one within you that asks, "Why do I feel this way?" That's where healing begins. Not in certainty, but in curiosity. Not in control, but in compassion. So tonight, when you close your eyes, think of your unconscious not as an enemy to conquer, but as a child to listen to. Ask it gently, "What are you trying to show me?" Maybe it will answer in a dream, maybe in a memory, maybe in the simple feeling that you are, at last, beginning to come home to yourself. And when you wake tomorrow, notice how you move through the world. Notice how people mirror your inner state. Notice the old patterns that try to pull you back, but also notice the new space, the pause, the breath that awareness has created. That's the beginning of freedom. That's the quiet revolution Freud hoped for. Not perfection, but consciousness. Not happiness as a constant state, but the courage to feel life in all its fullness, the joy, the grief, the confusion, the wonder. Because in the end, the flaw Freud exposed isn't just psychological. It's the flaw that makes us human, the impossibility of complete self-knowledge, and the beauty that comes from trying anyway. We are mysteries to ourselves, and yet, in the act of exploring that mystery, we create art, love, compassion. Maybe we never cure the flaw, maybe we just learn to live gracefully with it. And if that's true, then every struggle you've had, every heartbreak, every doubt, every relapse into an old pattern has not been wasted. It's all part of your awakening. The unconscious isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to complete you. So as this reflection ends, take one last deep breath. Feel your own presence here, now. Everything you've avoided, everything you've repressed is still part of you, waiting not for judgment but for love. That, Freud would say, is the ultimate therapy, to bring love where fear once lived. And maybe that's what he wanted us to understand all along, that the flaw is not our downfall. It's our invitation to heal,